Hey guys, back again. We started off this unit by really focusing in on India and Gandhi and what was Gandhi's role in Indian independence. And you guys went on to take a look at the partition of India or the separation of India into India and Pakistan and why that happened and how that, influenced history and what was the impact of that on Gandhi. And you guys kind of took a look at some of that stuff. So the next major topic in this unit is South Africa and Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela is the individual that's kind of going to become the figurehead for South African independence, quote unquote. And we will kind of go over that. Now, look, in during the course of regular class, when we do this stuff in the classroom, we do a deep dive on both of these individuals. So, we have to understand on the front end that there's a lot more to these people than we're going to be able to cover over these virtual lessons because there's just not enough time. So, we're just giving you kind of brief summaries about these people, but please, please, please understand that we are really only just scratching the surface on a lot of the detail and a lot of the kind of real deep dive understanding about what is the historical and cultural and social and political impact of these people on their countries. Okay, so just understand that to begin with. So here we go. Let's go back and talk about real quick kind of the political history of South Africa as it relates to this topic. So, look, the we could do a whole course on South African history, but it's fought over between the Dutch and the British for a long, long time. They fight a war over it called the Boer War. Long story short, fast forward, kind of Berlin Conference, Great Britain is in control of the colony of South Africa. So for the next 100 years, white European settlers are going to kind of dominate South Africa. And they are there, if you guys think back to imperialism or what the purpose of imperialism was, they're there to mine gold and diamonds, which were discovered there in the late 1800s. So there is incredible wealth in the resources that can be stripped from South Africa. So that is the allure of South Africa to European nations. So suffice it to say that when European settlers are kind of in control of the diamond and gold mining operations in South Africa, they are by far politically, socially, and economically the most powerful people in South Africa. Look, 1910, Britain is continuing to kind of decolonize, and they won't really ultimately finish, decolonizing all of their empire until after World War II. But in 1910, South Africa is granted independence, kind of, sort of, where Great Britain says, okay, South Africa, you kind of just decide things for yourself, and we are not going to govern you anymore. You're no longer a British colony. But they just kind of packed up their stuff and left. The government did anyway. And what happened was all these business people, these European settlers that kind of settled in South Africa to mine diamonds and gold, even after Britain grants independence to South Africa, a lot of these economic leaders and these figures stay there. So essentially, even though they're granted independence, it is still the white European settlers who are there to exploit the resources that remain in power in South Africa. So even though a European government is not governing South Africa is still, by extension, under the control of white Europeans. So that's an important part to understand, okay? And I mean, they're pulling diamonds the size of fists out of the ground. It's insane over there. So we understand the allure of, South Africa and why it's so hard for these people to walk away. So, what does that lead to? Well, these white European settlers that have been existing in this system and profiting from it for so long want very badly to solidify their positions of power and prevent others from rising up against them. So, what they do is they install a system of extreme segregation called apartheid. Now, when we say segregation, I think we usually think of the American South and, water fountains that, these are for whites and these are for blacks. And you have to go to different restaurants and, sit in certain places and so on and so forth. So this form of segregation called apartheid in South Africa is like segregation on steroids. They're not doing separate water fountains, they're doing separate cities. So this entire city and this entire geographic location is particularly intended for the use of blacks or natives, etc. And then over here, this is a white only territory, etc. And there's still parts of South Africa that kind of not legally but de facto remain this segregated today in South Africa. So this system of apartheid is like inequality and racism on steroids, and it's just super duper extreme segregation. So there's a lot of laws that were put in place by the powerful elite there, like, for example, pass laws. So native South Africans, black South Africans, were not allowed to travel from place to place freely throughout South Africa. They had to carry a passbook that gave them permission to go from place to place. And it was basically like a form of identification for them. So the white, powerful elites in South Africa restricted the movement of native blacks, and they also, had a lot of other constraints applied to them also. So the group in South Africa that's really going to fight back against this condition is called the African National Congress. So that's something that we certainly do need to know about this topic, the ANC. The ANC fought for the right of native black South Africans to participate in their own government. Um, Popular election was not a thing in South Africa. The powerful white settlers that remained there kind of installed a system of government that was designed to keep them in power and never allow for the election fairly of other leaders. And the ANC kind of fought back against this. Now, the African National Congress was a huge organization, and it had a lot of different kind of factions or wings to this organization. So some of it, a lot of the ANC is just political activism. It's about, getting the word out and trying to protest peacefully and so on and so forth. But there were other parts of the African National Congress that were almost paramilitary, that took a more, aggressive, for lack of a better term, approach to this independence movement for native blacks in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was a radical leader of one of those more militant wings of the ANC. Um, well, what happens to Mandela? Well, Mandela and his group engage in a bunch of really violent activities intended to kind of convince the white powerful elite to either abandon Africa or at the very least kind of change the way it's governed and allow for popular elections and democratic processes and so on and so forth. So Nelson Mandela and his crew do a bunch of things. One of which is they bomb a police station, and that he's arrested for, and a bunch of his followers, and he's thrown in prison with very little due process. And he basically is thrown in prison to rot for 27 years. And eventually, there's a movement behind getting him freed and out of prison, and a white South African leader named F.W. de Klerk, when he comes to head the South African government, starts to crumble to the public pressure of freeing Nelson Mandela and kind of instituting national elections that are way more fair and democratic and include the native South Africans in the process. So in the early 90s, Mandela is freed from prison, and Mandela and de Klerk actually work together to kind of eliminate and do what they can to eradicate the remnants of this system of segregation called apartheid, at least as it is a national policy. And they tried to do away with that. And they were both actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize together for their work together on eliminating apartheid, or at least, fighting back against apartheid in South Africa. So in 1994, South Africa finally has their first democratic elections, and Nelson Mandela wins the election and is named president of South Africa. And this is kind of, the story coming full circle to where now the native South Africans have their representation in government, and, they have their most outspoken and prominent leader sitting at the head of a government that they elected. and that is kind of really the short version of the end of apartheid and kind of Mandela's influence on South Africa. So much like Gandhi, what you guys are going to start with is you're going to start with a web quest. So a lot of this is really just let's begin by getting to know this Mandela person and kind of some of the major events of his life because again we know the things that people go through kind of inform their outlook on the world. So we can kind of make some of those connections with the web quest. So just use whatever means necessary as far as the internet goes. And there's some tips and hints on the web quest to answer the questions on the worksheet and just get a good idea of Mandela and kind of what he's about. And then as we move forward, we will kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive. But again, we can't go as far as we want with all this stuff for time's sake. So start with that, and then we'll go from there. So complete the web quest. Let me know if you guys need any help, and see you soon. Later.